Happy Friday, everyone. Happy end of Constitution Week.
Yay!
I want to thank Stacy and Catherine, who's not, there she is. Hi, Catherine. Thank you again for all your help you've provided, and Paul and Andrea and all those others that have kind of helped work on this week. It's been a busy week, and I hope lots of trivia points and scavenger questions and stuff have been compiled. I guess, who's going to make that announcement? You get to be the announcer.
We have to give her something to do or she pouts.
I got you. So anyway, it's fun to be a part of this, and I appreciate your putting up with this. Since this is, obviously a presidential election year, I thought it might be an opportunity to look at the Constitution from the point of view of presidential elections and look at what the Constitution has to say about all that. I'll also throw in at the end a little bit having to do with kind of the pros and cons of the Electoral College. I want to clarify, there's another thing called Conductivity Day going on at Rose Hall, and they're having electrical collage discussions. That's just up the road. If anybody happens to be in the wrong room, welcome, and we'll do the best we can. Kind of ohms and amps and volts, oh my. We start with the Constitutional Convention 225 years ago. I don't know what the hallmark gift is for 225th anniversary, but whatever it is, that was what we should have had this week. You should know or recall anyway that the idea of the Electoral College was a compromise in the end between the choice of having the legislature choose the president and having the people vote directly for the president. They ruled out the legislature on the idea of separation of powers, that would make the executive too much a creature of the Congress, and so that wouldn't fly. They ruled out direct election, in part because they had a nice, healthy skepticism of democracy, and in part because they understood, the founders, that the new republic was not going to be able to administer and run an election. In terms of communications and transportation of the day wouldn't work to tally votes and monitor elections in the way necessary. So the takeaway needs to be, I think, from the founders' point of view in terms of setting up the Electoral College, is that they saw politics as a way not to reconcile differences, but as a way of transcending differences. And they had a vision of a new republic that was utopian, really, very idealistic in nature, that in effect wanted to take the politicians out of politics. That's normally a laugh line, but that's okay. It's early yet, and you're still chewing and digesting. But that was their intent. And it is kind of ironic when you think about how hard-nosed their understanding was of human nature. They had a pretty unblemished view of mankind. And yet they thought in setting up the Electoral College they could somehow bleach the politics out of the system. Let me start, because I'm going to want to make you talk with your mouths full. If I told you that the first three articles of the Constitution each dealt with a separate branch of our federal government, which article do you suppose would be the one that addresses the executive? No, you don't get to count. Yeah. Anyone?
Come on, Simon.
Oh, I know. I thought I read the students' nonsense.
You only have three choices. And we know that
the first one.
Well, no, because the first article is dedicated to the most democratic of all, the Congress, the legislature.
Okay, it's Article 2.
Two. We have a winner. Put that down. That's a point, or half a point for Paul. Article 2, that's correct. And this is where the Constitution establishes the Electoral College. I should point out that the term Electoral College does not appear in the Constitution. But then, of course, neither does Hogwarts Academy. And we know how important that's become. And similar to Hogwarts Academy, the Electoral College is also a fictional creation. Right? It doesn't exist. It's not a building. It's not a place. It's kind of a colloquial term. It didn't even have legal meaning, really, until it inserted itself into federal law back in the middle of the 19th century. It basically is just a colloquial term for when the people get together to do the voting. And we'll talk more about that later, because it's not the people you might think it is that do the voting. So there are 5 basic guidelines in the Constitution that deal with how we elect a president. This is the first one. setting the number of electors that each state can have equal to the number of senators and representatives that they have. I'll get back to this in a little further detail momentarily. Secondly, they give the states complete authority in how this system runs. So the Congress, the federal government that is, transfers all authority to the states in terms of how they pick their electors. By the mid-19th century, they had all adopted a system of popular votes. So, for example, this November when we all go to the polls to vote, that's a popular voting for an elector. Prior to that time, there was a lot of other systems. Some states wanted the legislature to just name who the electors would be. Some states wanted the popular vote, and some states changed it from election to election for political purposes. I know that sounds odd, but we have plenty of experience of that today in different ways. So it's not the Congress, or not the Constitution, in other words, that controls this aspect. It's state law, because the Constitution has given the states complete authority in this respect. The third item has to do with who the electors are and what they do. The electors are the ones that actually place the votes for president and vice president. The Constitution is also very specific in having them meet separately, because they didn't want them to get together and conspire and strategically decide who to vote for and how to vote. Of course, that was before Twitter and everything else. Back in those days, mobile device was what they called their horses. But an explicit point in the Constitution of keeping the electors in separate locations for the purpose of the vote. Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist 68 also points out that it's important that the electors be constituted on an ad hoc basis. So those that convene this year and vote in this election will be different than those that voted last time, and that those will vote again. And he felt that turnover, that ad hoc nature, would also keep it real and keep it from being manipulated by outside sources or by intrigue among conspiracies among the voters. So let me ask a question about these electors. Suppose this year that Governor Romney gets the most votes in the state of Indiana, which is not much of a leap, because Indiana, in the elections that we've had where the Democrats and Republicans were the two major parties, the Republicans have carried the state of Indiana 3/4 of the time. Okay, so let's say that Romney gets the majority of the votes in this state, and therefore carries the state. Does the Constitution therefore tell our electors that they have to place their votes for Governor Romney? Anyone?
No.
No, it doesn't.
No.
Okay. So is it the state law then? Is it state law that says if Romney carries the votes in the state that the elector has to put their vote down?
No.
No.
Yes.
That's correct. That's correct. Some states actually tried to legislate that. Most states have not. And in the end, it's moot, because no one has ever gone to prison or been penalized. But the punchline of all this is that just because Romney carries the state doesn't mean the elector has to vote for him. Okay? The so-called idea of the faithless elector. We elect the elector, who then is supposed to put his vote where we told him or her. But there's no law that says it has to, and even when there are laws, it's not necessarily true that that law would actually be effective. Okay? There have been dozens of cases where electors have not put their vote where they were supposed to. The most recent was in 2004, when an elector in Minnesota cast both votes for John Edwards. They wanted to vote for the Kerry Edwards ticket, but they placed both votes for Edwards. So that was a boo-boo. Prior to that, in 2000, there was an elector in Washington, D.C. who refused to put votes down. D.C. was carried in 2000 by Gore and Lieberman, but the elector in D.C., one of the electors that D.C. had, refused to put any votes down as a protest for the fact that D.C. was not represented in Congress. So just because an elector is supposedly entrusted with our votes doesn't mean necessarily that the elector will do the right thing, and technically there's no recourse. They can do, in the end, they can do what they want. It's not common, and it never has determined the outcome of an election, but it's there. Let's go on. If the Constitution says the candidate who receives the majority of the presidential votes gets to occupy the White House, And the next candidate, in terms of the vote totals, gets to be the vice president. At least that was the original Constitution. So let me ask, what if nobody gets a majority?
That wasn't the original. That's after they picked it.
No, that's the original.
Yeah, you're right. This is the 12th Amendment. You're right.
The 12th Amendment.
Yeah, because the original said the majority gets to be the president and whoever's next gets to be the vice. But in 1804, the 12th Amendment was passed to change it slightly so that you had to be a majority to get the vice president among those ballots cast for vice president. So let me go back to my question. What if you don't get the majority? What happens? What if there is no majority winner? She knows, but I know. Who else? So suppose all the votes get cast and nobody gets the majority. We just go back to our business.
The one with the most votes.
Goes to the House of Representatives. That's correct. So the House gets to resolve the outcome of the election. And when the House votes, they vote by one state and one vote. So if you happen to be a state with multiple reps, too bad, you just get one vote just like every other state. So that kind of empowers the smaller states relative to the bigger states. And this is what some of the signers and some of the founders thought would be a bone for the smaller states. That the bigger states will have more reps, but in the end, if it comes down to a tie, we're all on equal footing. So the intent from the original Constitution was to have the electors kind of be a nominating committee. They would nominate different names for who should be voted for. And the assumption was the vote would be so split that no one would get the majority, and in the end it would be the House that would decide. One of the founders, not one of the signers, because he refused to sign the Constitution, George Mason, predicted that basically 19 times out of 20 there would be no majority and it would end up going to the House. That ended up not being the case, but that's what he thought. And that's the answer. You got it. Congratulations. Now let me go back to that first item. We say that each state is allocated a number of electors equal to its seats in Congress. We know each state gets 2 senators, right? How do we know that's in Article 1, Section 3? How do we know how the number of representatives is determined? Anyone?
Census.
Jackie knows.
Census?
Okay, by population. Okay? The actual formula includes, I kid you not, the square root sign. So we wish some of the Rose folks were here today, but they're not. But fundamentally it gets down to the size of the population. That's correct. And for this we go to Article 1, which says each state will have at least one member, and the Constitution specifies that we'll have no more than 1 rep per 30,000 population. The original size of the House of Representatives at the founding was 65. It grew up to 435 in the early part of the 20th century and was capped shortly thereafter. Today, the ratio so this is the maximum, 1 per 30,000. The ratio today, just so you know, based on the 2010 census, is 1 per 710,000. Okay? So just for fun, and that's why we're here, how many members of the House of Representatives would we have today if we allowed Congress to go back to the size as specified in the Constitution?
All right, Janet. All right, Janet. You're on your own.
No slide rules.
It'd probably be
How many?
C. So 1 per 7 so that's
I love it.
I say D.
3.
The suspense is killing me. Is it killing you? Or is it just killing your appetite?
Oh,
It's math.
It's D, I guess.
You want to reconsider your answer?
I'm good.
yeah, we want.
It would have. You should have typed up.
I know.
The House would have 10,300 plus members. Now, I know, well, first of all, if you think Washington doesn't work now. But on top of that, although we all recognize and acknowledge that the government is unable to create jobs, I submit to you that if this were the case, we would have not only 10,000 new members of Congress, but if you use the ratio of 7 lobbyists per member, which is basically what we have now, that's 70,000 jobs right there.
Not to mention staff.
Yeah, there you go. That's right. Staff, absolutely. If anyone's interested in a good chuckle, there's a website called 30,000.org. That's the number 30-1000.org. That is very serious about proposing this and has a fairly ample website that discusses all the wrinkles of this idea. But I digress. There are some additional constitutional provisions that I think we need to spend a second on today. To date, there have been 27 amendments to the Constitution. The last was submitted in 1789 and ratified 200 years later. The 27th Amendment deals with congressional pay. They can't raise their own pay for the same Congress in which they're serving. But of the 27 amendments, we've had 7 that pertain to how we elect the president. The 2 most important are here. We mentioned already the 12th Amendment, which created the divided ballot so that electors would vote separately for president and vice president. Because before they had a single ballot and it got very confusing, as Thomas Jefferson could tell you. And the 23rd Amendment, which grants electors to the District of Columbia. The District of Columbia is not a state. They are not represented in voting terms in the Congress, but they have electors, according to the 23rd Amendment. Passed in 61, so 1964 was the first election that they participated in, the District of Columbia. They were set at the minimum of the least populous state, which means that there are 7 states that have only 1 representative. So 1 representative plus 2 senators means that the District of Columbia gets 3 electoral votes, as do those other small states. The other 5 amendments affecting how our president is elected deal with protecting and expanding voting rights. Anybody remember when we used to do that? Seems so old-fashioned now, doesn't it? And there they are, and you see the dates. So between the original Constitution and these 7 amendments, we've kind of touched base at least a little bit with respect to what the Constitution has to say about how we elect a president. Let's look a little more closely now at electoral votes and how they're distributed. This, based on the 2010 census, is the number of electoral votes allocated to each state. So you see them there. Notice that in every case but 2, Maine and Nebraska, there's just a single number. In Maine and Nebraska, they have divided their votes according to who wins the overall state versus who wins congressional district by congressional district. And up until the 2008 election, there was never any difference. In other words, if you won Nebraska, you got all of its electoral vote. Actually, 2008 was the first time President Obama picked off one of these congressional districts. He lost the state, he picked off 1 vote from the district. All the other states, it's a winner-take-all. So if you win the state, you win all the electoral votes.
New Jersey? It's winner-take-all now?
Yeah.
Basically.
Colorado was the last to have proposed as a constitutional amendment a split-up kind of system, and it failed to pass. I think that was in 2004.
California did a couple of years back as well. It was proposed and rejected.
Okay, thank you. So there are a few states that have played that game, but by and large, they have not. And just so you know, the reason tends to be that a state, as a state, wants to have as much influence on the election as they can. And they fear that by dividing up their votes, they will not have, if every other state is throwing all their weight behind one or the other candidate, that if they play the divide-up game, they're not going to have that kind of influence, and so they don't want to do that. Now, with the House size capped at 435, which was done back in 1929, the census comes along every 10 years and reallocates the numbers. And this, as I say, is the latest allocation, a process known as reapportionment. As a result of the 2010 census, 12 seats and hence 12 electors were shifted. And there you see the winners and the losers. Okay? So obviously the big winners, Texas and Florida. The big losers, Ohio and New York. And this will be, because the 2010 census, of course, won't be overridden until the 2020 census. This will be the rule for not only 2012 this year, but 2016 and 2020. So for 2 more times. You can see here that Indiana was not affected for the last census. Okay, we're holding steady. So should I go ahead and just assume then that the 11 that we have is pretty much our high water mark? That our 11 electors is pretty much our historical high? We didn't lose any last time. Yes, no, maybe? Digesting? Not digesting as well as one hoped?
Relative to other states, so Indiana's probably gone down.
Well, yeah, certainly relative to other states, that's true. But relative to where we were before the last census, for instance.
I bet we went down.
A betting woman. And you'd be right. This busy little sucker shows the number of electoral votes that Indiana has had since we joined the Union back in 1816. And you see we peaked back here basically from I'll cheat for you and fill in the axis, 1872 to 1932. So from the 1870 census to the 1920 census, we hit our max at 15. And during that time, so there were 15 elections where we had this number of electoral votes. During that time, this particular period here, 50-some years, the United States added 11 states and tripled in population. And as that happened, the influence, the weight of Indiana's vote diminished. So we lost, in the 1930 census, we lost 1. Beep. In the 1940 census, we lost 1. Beep. That's the sound they made. In the 1980 census, and then again in the 2000 census. And the red bar just indicates where we are right now, and we're going to be there for the next 2 cycles. Paul?
Well, the depression would have hit and people would have left Indiana as an industrial state.
Right. I mean, that's...
After the farm in Kentucky problem.
There you go. Okay. Yeah, so there's all kinds of population changes, including just the aggregate in the country at large. So back 1840 was the last time we had fewer electoral votes than we had today. And of course, we all remember that election. That was when we voted for our first territorial governor, that old Whig, William Henry Harrison. And for all of our trouble, he survived 32 days in the White House. Never do that.
Didn't listen to his voice.
No, I know.
Your coat.
Well, I mean, what kind of name is that? Really? So let's take a look at how the Electoral College works in practice. We have basically 3 phases of presidential elections. This is where somebody's supposed to say, "Don't faze me, bro." The day we think of as Election Day is when we all go to the polls and do our thing, right? Set by Title III of the U.S. Code. So again, not in the Constitution, but in federal law. And so again, the indirect process, we vote for people who then vote for the president. This is set for the first Tuesday after the first Monday. That's the legal definition of Election Day. It was established back in 1845 uniformly across the nation, because up till then it had been all over the place. John Stewart, as you probably know, wrote a history of America and said the reason we chose the first Tuesday after the first Monday was that choosing the first Thursday after the second Saturday would just be plain silly. The real Election Day, you might say, is when the Electoral College meets, and again, these are the electors in each state capital get together and supposedly do the will of the people, unless they don't, but mostly they do. And that is set, again, by that federal law as the first Monday after the second Wednesday. And that's the real Election Day, we should say. And then the third Election Day is when everything gets kind of logged in the book as no kidding, for real. And that is set as January 6th, except Congress says sometimes that works out to be a Sunday, as it will, in fact, in 2013, and so we might nudge it around one way or the other a day or two. Not shown here, of course, is Inauguration Day, which is January 20th, and Super Bowl Sunday, where we try to forget about this last couple of years. So just to review, when you go to the polls on this day, you're really not electing the president. You're electing these people that will then meet later to elect the president. And they'll do the real voting. And just so you know, it might make you feel a little better when you get into the booth. If you're voting for Romney this year in the state of Indiana, you're actually voting for Beverly, Robert, Eric, 11 people that will come from all over the state that are Republican loyalists and fundraisers and what have you. Party hack is too mean a term. But those are the 11 people that will be our electors if we end up carrying the state for Romney. For Obama, here they are. He's a card. You've got to watch him. And then if you happen to be a Libertarian supporter, they are the only other party that's on the ballot without a sign-in in the state of Indiana, then those will be your 11 electors. In 42 states, including Indiana, the names of these folks do not appear on your ballot. They do appear on the ballot in some states, which can only be highly confusing, I would think. Usually in smaller type, but not always, so it's kind of weird. Now let's have a few more trivia questions. We're having so much fun, don't you think? There's the answer to the first one. How many states, what's the minimum number of states that need to vote the same way to elect a president? Only 11. If those 11 states with stars, which have to, of course, be the ones with the most electoral votes, vote all the same way, then we've reached 270, and we have a new president. Does that seem weird? 11 states could have that much? It does?
Depends on the states.
Okay. I mean,
balance, though, between conservative and liberal, red and blue.
yeah, it's very unlikely. In fact, Obama carried 9 of those, except for Texas and Georgia. So there's a fair shot that nobody's going to carry them all, the way our current politics work. It strikes many people 11 out of 50. It doesn't seem right that they would have that much influence, but if you put it in terms on which these votes are based, that is population, those 11 states have 57% of our population. And cast 55% of the votes in 2008. So they are, as you would expect, the bulk of the states in terms of electoral weight. So it's a kind of a gotcha question to think that only 11 could have that much influence, because in fact they do have that much population. Okay, we're on a roll, I feel it. In the last 50 years, which is basically since DC has been a part of the vote, and we've had the same number of electoral votes in total, what is the greatest number of states that a candidate has carried in a given election?
Reagan 84.
Here's your choices.
He's really high up.
I was going to say C, Reagan in 84.
49.
49? Everybody seems to be agreeing. Bingo. Twice. What a deal. Okay. Well, since that was so easy, let's
I guess I read them, but I...
flip it around. Yeah, you wouldn't think Nixon, right?
I know.
Wow, but who was he running against?
Yeah, that was. Who remembers is the problem. Who did he run against?
Okay, so what's the fewest, the lowest number of states carried by the winning candidate?
22.
22? Any other takers? 28?
Since what year? Oh, that's
Since 1964, basically.
B, A.
A? It is.
Oh, wow, JFK.
Those happen to be the 4 lowest numbers of states carried in the last 50 years, and there are the others.
Oh, my goodness.
Obama hits the top 4 or bottom 4, depending on how you look at it.
Obama, Bush, Carter,
The average in that period is about 35, so these are all below average. They are the smallest numbers that have been carried.
you've got 3 Democrats and 1 Republican.
No, yeah, 3 Dems, 1 Rep, yeah.
Is there any feeling among Republicans that the Democrats have too much majority because they have the coasts and the...
Yeah, I mean, that's how you would look at it. politically is where those votes are coming from, and the Democrats get,
Because those are so populous in there.
yeah, you get the Atlantic Seaboard, you get the left coast. Okay, since 1860, just going back, only Paul and I go back this far. What is the highest share of the electoral vote recorded by the winning candidate? So the highest share, now percentage of the electoral vote.
C.
Well, here it comes. Are you ready?
Whoa, wow.
Oh, yeah.
FDR and Reagan, wow.
Kind of the two transformational presidents
Well,
of
opposite,
the 20th century. Carried 98%. Other honorable mentions, Nixon and his suite carried 97%. And Lincoln and Reagan carried 91%.
Yeah.
The average in that period was 72, and Obama carried 68, or got 68% of the electoral vote. Okay, let me bring the room down a little bit. I think there's too much electricity. I'm starting to feel it. Maybe it's just static electricity. Let me move to my closing topic today, which has to do with the pros and cons of the Electoral College. First of all, by show of hands, how many of you think we should keep the Electoral College? Okay. So, 6 or so out of however many we have here, so maybe a third, give or take. Okay, and the rest presumably?
We don't know. We haven't decided.
Okay, decided. Swing voters.
Yeah.
Want to get rid of it then.
How many want to get rid of it?
Paul and Jean Ann.
So everyone else is pretty much undecided? Is that?
Yeah.
Sweet.
Sweet.
We can work on you people. Just so you know. Yes, question?
I just have, well, we're talking about the Electoral College. What if it turns out, okay, a state with 10 electoral votes receives like a, I know it's unimaginable, but a 98% voter turnout.
Right.
But then a state with 29 electoral votes receives a 15% voter turnout.
That's really...
I mean, those are two very unlikely numbers, but to put it into perspective, to me that's one of the problems of the electoral.
No, that's absolutely right. We don't see those extremes, but we do certainly see extremes. So turnout, and all you need to do is win by one, and you get the whole state.
Yeah.
Unless you're one of those two. So yeah, there's some wrinkles there.
We raise our hand.
But again, remember, that's not it's a valid issue and it's a concern, but it doesn't necessarily mean changing the Electoral College in constitutional terms. It means changing the electoral rules state by state by state by state.
Oh, okay, let's vote.
Well, let's see how you stack up. We don't have independence in this chart, but we see from 1967 to 1980 the Gallup poll results. How would you approve or disapprove of an amendment to the Constitution which would do away with the Electoral College and base the election of president on the total vote cast throughout the nation? So correct popular vote. You see the ratio kind of peaked. This was a peak year. President Nixon and bunches of people on the Hill actually supported abolishing it. Didn't quite make it. But it's still predominantly in favor of abolish. And this is a more recent period from the turn of the century. And again, it asks to amend the Constitution or to keep the current system. And popular vote, again, a dominant majority, although not as dominant as in the past. The pros, the people who advance the cause of retaining the Electoral College, generally three arguments. There's bunches, but these are the major ones. That the states maintain an important role, that the Constitution was, after all, set up under a federal structure where the national government would have some authorities and the state governments would have others, and so they would like to keep that. And also from a small state perspective, they certainly want to keep their voice in the game. Another argument, that's a kind of a theoretical argument. A practical argument is it kills any third parties. And so if you're a party functionary from Democrats or the Republicans, you love the Electoral College because it keeps the riffraff out, right? So there's that argument. And then the last thing, again, from a practical perspective, is that you can almost always get a clear and quick resolution to the election. Okay? There have only been 4 exceptions. The most recent, of course, was in Florida in the year 2000. By and large, everything else gets resolved fairly promptly. And so from a practical perspective, the Electoral College is very good in that respect. On the other side, from a theoretical point of view, it turns out it's not very democratic for these reasons. And I've got some backup charts I'll quickly go through to kind of illustrate the points I'm making there. From a more abstract idea, the idea that it's just so complex and obscure and nobody really understands it. Why do we do it? We're the only major democracy in the world, obviously, that has anything quite as peculiar as this. And that if you go back to the initial rationale, constitutional scholars are highly offended. One of the rationales, which I didn't bring up, was the idea of kind of mollifying the slave states. And because that was so offensive to begin with, and because we don't really deal with the problems that were with us at the founding, in terms of being unable to really monitor an election and manage it at great distances and so forth, the rationale for it, including federalism, some people argue, is no longer really relevant. These are presidents, vice presidents of the country, not of the 50 states separately. And so those are the 3 arguments, generally that are against the college. Now, since I've promised you, I'll give you a couple of examples of the will of the majority. You'll see at the bottom graph the percentage of popular vote won by the winning candidate. You will see for each candidate, for each victory, the percentage of the electoral vote. You can see the average. You can average, since 1824, which is basically the first year that we were able to record popular votes, the average winning share was 51%. But you can see a 20-point differential, generally, between the winner's share in terms of direct popular votes and the electoral share. So some might say, yeah, that creates a mandate. You know, you can, yes?
Professor Moore?
Be smart.
What could you go over what happened in 2000 with Gore and Wood? Okay.
There's not enough time to begin that discussion.
Only to say that there have been 4 times when the election wasn't resolved immediately. 2 went to the House of Representatives, 2 went to what you could almost call partisan committees. One was in 1876 and one was in the year 2000. In all 4 cases, the Republican ends up winning.
You said it doesn't matter that it's not democratic, but it doesn't really matter because we're not a democracy, we're a republic.
Right?
So, for the purpose of our government, we have the right representation.
That's absolutely right. And that's a nice counter-argument. To which the other argument would be that when we established ourselves as a republic, we were concerned foremost and above all about liberty.
Yeah.
Now, you can argue that we are less concerned about the tyrant and more concerned about democratic representation. I mean, and that argument goes around and around. I'm not saying that either side is right or wrong. But you're absolutely right. And it kind of begs the question of what do we mean by republic? And that's another conversation. So you think, well, the good thing about the Electoral College is it gives a mandate. Let me ask you. There is the Electoral College vote in 1980 when Reagan creamed Carter, 91% of the electoral vote. What do you suppose his percent of the popular vote was that year? Pretty awesome, right?
70.
70-some?
55 or 60.
55 or 60? You're close. 51.
Wow.
51% of the popular vote. So you say to yourself, yeah, the Electoral College gave a mandate, but did it give a mandate that really wasn't there? What you don't see here, although he won no electoral votes, is John Anderson, who peeled off lots and lots of votes, and accounts for the fact that Reagan was able to carry so few of the majority and still get all those electoral votes. Here's another look at majority rule. In 47 elections since 1824, there have been roughly 10% of the time, let's say 9, where the person who won the White House actually had fewer popular votes than electoral votes.
Wow.
Okay. There's another quarter of the time where, yeah, the person who won the most, but actually had more votes against than for.
Wow.
That's kind of a loaded thing, though, because when you say it's a wrong winner, you're presupposing that the popular vote ought to decide it. When it's just
That's an excellent point, and that's another argument that is made. It's what makes it wrong. I mean, he won the electoral vote, so by the rules, he's the right winner. Only in the point of view of saying, is it the majority rule in terms of popular vote? Would we say, maybe not? I mean, it depends how you stand in the year 2000, most recently. So a quarter of the time, the popular vote and the electoral vote was in favor of the ultimate winner, but the ultimate winner actually had more people voting against him than for him. Then 11% of the time, you had the right winner, that is, the popular vote and the electoral vote are all in sync, and everything worked out as it should. But if you had just a few states that had a shift of less than 1% of their votes, it would have been a different outcome. It would have been a wrong winner, if you'll excuse the term. Okay, so this causes some people, mostly those that aren't enamored with the Electoral College, to say that the Electoral College is kind of a disaster waiting to happen. That yeah, it hit the money 60% of the time, but there are enough other cases that kind of raise questions. Another point, just from a Democratic point of view, is how much is your vote worth? If you live in a tiny, tiny state, population-wise, you have your electoral vote, 100,000 population gets you an electoral vote. If you live in a big state, it takes you almost 700,000 population to get an electoral vote. I highlighted Indiana and the average just to show you we're just about, along with these other states, about on par. That is to say, we have about 2% of the national population, we get about 2% of the electoral vote total. So we're about right. We can't complain. And these guys certainly can't complain because they're loving it. Until the bison get the vote, and then they're going to be upset. And the big states not happy. They're underrepresented, relatively speaking. Lastly, disenfranchised votes. It turns out that in 2008, there were 43% of all the votes cast that didn't contribute one iota to the electoral outcome. That's because 16 million of Obama votes occurred in red states. You're out of there. And the majority, it turns out, of McCain voters had the misfortune of living in blue states. Okay, so all those voters...
Bye-bye. So sad.
But again, they're only disenfranchised if you're looking at it in terms of their votes, if they are voting for the president, which of course they're not. They were perfectly well franchised in terms of they participated in their state election for the electors on the state level.
Right.
I get very anxious when people talk about disenfranchisement and what they really mean is loss. I mean, I'm not disenfranchised because I participate in an election and lose.
Yeah, you are if you're... I mean, the difference would be in a popular vote system, you could vote for the loser and still say my vote counted.
It did. I just didn't get enough of them.
And in this case, your vote didn't. The comeback, I mean, part of your argument is to say, the defense of the Electoral College on this is that, yeah, the Electoral College is perfectly democratic, state by state by state. In a given state, it's perfectly democratic. Whoever wins that state wins that vote, unless you have faithless electors, but that's a minor problem. So if you accept, and that's kind of the bottom line, if you accept the federal argument, states should be considered equal to or even transcendent to the national government in affairs such as this, then you say Electoral College is your bag. If, on the other hand, you say that it's democracy, not federalism, that you'd rather have democracy in a federal and a national sense, that we're voting for a national leader, not a state by state by state leader, then you get the other argument. I think this is my last slide. Bless you. In favor of the status quo, and the reason why it ain't going to change. Did I give it away? You can't amend the Constitution. Extremely difficult, except without state participation. We've already said the states have all the marbles, and they're not going to throw them away. There is a lack of urgency. 2000 came and went. It wasn't even a spike. It was in the 60s that we had the last close call to getting rid of the Electoral College. The revival of constitutional originalism, that is to say, we now want to go back to getting rid of the 17th Amendment, which allows us to elect senators on a direct basis. We want to maybe go back to a ratio that would give us 10,000 representatives in the House. I mean, there's this movement now, right? And the more of that there is, the less incentive there's going to be to do anything vile with the Electoral College. There's a lack of consensus. Some people want to change it or get rid of it, basically, versus maybe just tweak it so that electoral votes are divided up differently and so forth and so on. And as I mentioned, that isn't really a constitutional question anyway. That's a state-by-state legal question. And lastly, unlike in the 60s when we had Birch Bayh and President Nixon and all kinds of crazy people in favor of this change. Presently, there is no important champion. And so in that respect, there's no real energy or impetus for the change. Sorry, that's all I got.
Why release the names of the people who are the electors of each state, like before the election? Before they have, I guess if they vote and they don't vote the way that the state goes,
right?
Say, okay, here are the people you can blame. You can blame them, but couldn't there be some maybe behind the door stuff if you give out their names prior to the election?
I suppose I could. Just so you know, it is a matter of public record. Each party, and including the Libertarians, have their party conventions in the summer, and part of their business at those conventions is to name and decide on these individuals, usually rewarding party loyalists and other players. And so it's just a matter of public record. Oftentimes, for example, in a case I told you where the Minnesota elector back in 2000 put 2 votes to Edwards and none to Kerry, that was, no one knew what elector that was. So in that respect, that was a closed door. In the case of the D.C. Faithless elector in 2004, everyone knew who that was because she made a point of saying, I'm doing this as a protest. Questions, comments? Yes.
I have a question about the African American vote in the South. The South is usually carried now by Republicans, and yet a lot of southern states, the vast majority of people in the state are African American who tend to vote Democratic. Is there just a lower turnout? Is there what's going on there? Do you think?
That's a good question. Any other questions? I don't know the answer. I mean, that is kind of a. Let me see if I have, just so you can have it here. There was the 08 election. You see how red it is down here. How red it is. It tends to be lately.
I know Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama are 80% or more.
Yeah.
That sounds awfully high.
No, maybe 30 or 40 even percent.
I don't know the numbers actually, so I'm not sure, but that is a question.
They are really.
Black though.
And so when there's a close call, as we've seen this year, we want to make sure they can't vote, right? By creating requirements that may or may not be that easy to meet.
Are any of those laws going to be in effect, like Ohio and Pennsylvania, still going to be in effect, those voter ID laws that will prevent 1 million people in each of those states from voting?
The last I heard, Pennsylvania kicked it back from the Supreme Court to lower court to review and say if it does have a discriminatory effect, you need to review your decision. I haven't heard about Ohio. I thought Texas was another one that had recently been kind of snagged.
Texas is subject to pre-clearance and it's currently caught up in that in D.C. I don't know if it's going to resolve in time for it to...
I mean, so the question, for instance, the Pennsylvania question seems to be a logical one, which is if it's in turmoil and we're not sure the effect and so forth, and exactly no in-person voter fraud has been established in the past, then what exactly is the urgency of having done this election? Keep it on the agenda, put it forward, and just keep working on it, and help prove to us that there A is a problem, and B that this helps solve it. And if you can do those things, then okay. But exactly why, with 50 days left, do we have to have it now?
It's got to go to court in order for that to stop it, though, that argument. A judge would have to give that argument to stop it.
I'm a judge. Bill Brennan used to say you can do anything on Hill with 5 votes. On the Supreme Court, you can do anything with 5 votes. But that doesn't matter how big it is with 5 votes.
Of course, they could just subscribe to Chicago politics, and that is if you ever lived or owned a cat, you can vote. And your cat can vote. Even if you're dead.
But there aren't many cases of that.
Well,
there was
that's right.
There was a study that just came out, right? We were watching about how many people vote. I forget.
Right. The fraud occurs in the registration in terms of in-person voting fraud. Turns out, A, there's no advantage to doing it, B, it doesn't happen. So, yeah, it's nice on paper to scratch it out, but At what cost?
But if they have this, I mean, I'm making a broad statement like everybody should have an ID, but like I asked in your class, if they have an ID, it gives them, you've got to have that drive, to cash a check, to do so many things.
Right.
And by trying to protect that segment of the population and say, oh, it's too hard for them to go get an ID, that's really holding them back from getting that ID that they need to do all these other things. So to me, it's not just about voting.
Maybe
Some of those people don't have cars or they don't have money to have a checking account.
The absurdity of it was brought home to me. The people who are suing over the voter ID laws, that in federal court, you can't walk into a federal courthouse without ID. So don't tell me that it's a problem to get ID. It's really not.
Well, no, it clearly is. It's just a matter of how many of these people need to walk into a federal courthouse.
It's older people. It's it's everybody. But once they get that ID, that's one of the tools that they need to advance in.
Maybe
yes,
they're on
there
their
should.
deathbed. They're not.
Hey,
Well, then they're not worried about that.
that's it. Yeah.
Since the argument falls on party lines now,
I mean,
both sides are.
Isn't that conspicuous?
Both sides.
That all the states doing this happen to be
Yeah,
but that happens with any issue.
Republican, and the effect happens to be most dominant on the Democrat.
Yeah, for California, the proposal, you think of the Democrats are more likely to support the democracy side rather than the federalist side.
Correct.
But when California proposed to split up its block vote, the Democrats immediately said, no, absolutely not, because they knew that just hands the Republican Party 40% of the vote in California, which they don't want. So every argument that has predictable partisan effects breaks along partisan lines.
Which raises the question in my mind: why aren't voting rights a matter of federal law?
They are.
Not the ones we're talking about.
No, just that it has to be equal.
Right. Because we're a federal country. But it kind of raises the question: if we're concerned about equal access to the polls on a national basis, and we suspect some states playing both sides, Democrats and Republicans, playing that game, why not just cut that out?
I think Congress actually has that authority in Article 1. And I remember right that Congress can preempt state law on at least on federal elections, and presumably state elections under pending jurisdiction.
Of course, with the Voting Rights Act of the 60s, and as you know,
But that's under the 14th Amendment.
Yeah.
15th Amendment, sorry.
as you know, that's going to be up for Supreme Court review next term. And predictions are it's going to
everyone said when the Mudd noted the Supreme Court that the Voting Rights Act was gone. It wasn't. So we'll see.
Yeah.
And maybe it's not the voter ID law that makes it so difficult. Maybe it's the requirements that you have to have just to get an ID that need changed.
That's it.
Not the fact that you have to have a photo ID to go vote, but
But you've got to fight your birth certificate from 80 years ago. In the state,
you have to have
don't
a
need it anymore.
yeah, like we saw tons of little old ladies who would come in, have to get their marriage license, and many times they wouldn't remember what county they were married in, what year, and it's difficult to get your license. It's not the fact that, I think everybody should have an ID too, but that rules out any, on both sides, you know.
Right.
But maybe the security aspects, you could have a little twerk in the laws to make it easier.
As we're talking class, we're going to go that far out of our way to make those laws and those requirements, and we probably ought to go somewhere out of our way to make it easier to get those documents somehow, with it, again, balancing the security questions. All righty then.